Think about the last truly good day you had. A meal that was exactly right. A conversation that ran long. Now think about the last bad one. Which came to mind faster? Which has more detail, more weight? Most people answer this the same way. There's a standard explanation for why. But the explanation has a problem. The standard account goes like this. The human brain evolved under conditions where missing a threat was far more costly than missing an opportunity. A predator you failed to notice could kill you. A berry bush you failed to find just meant you'd look elsewhere tomorrow. So natural selection, the story goes, built a kind of asymmetry into our memory systems. Negative experiences get encoded more deeply, retrieved more reliably, and held longer. This is what researchers call negativity bias. And in the popular science version, it's presented almost like a law of cognitive nature. Universal, hardwired. The reason you remember the one critical comment in a room full of compliments. The reason a bad commute lingers while a good one evaporates. The reason a single argument can overshadow weeks of warmth. The neuroscience half of this story is real. Emotional arousal, fear, threat, stress, does trigger the release of hormones like norepinephrine and vasopressin. These hormones interact with the amygdala and hippocampus in ways that can strengthen memory consolidation. Aversive experiences, under the right conditions, do tend to stick. Research going back decades confirms that emotionally charged events are remembered differently than neutral ones. So the framework isn't invented. It's not pseudoscience. But the leap from negative events can be well encoded to bad days are universally remembered better than good ones is a much larger leap than it first appears. A maxtric visualization of a gap between two concepts. A bridge partially built, hovering in midair over empty space. Here's the measurement problem nobody mentions in the popular version of this story. Almost all the foundational research on negativity bias in memory uses word lists, images of faces, lab-staged vignettes, a brief scenario described on a screen, or a controlled short video clip. Participants encode these stimuli under controlled conditions and then are tested on recall, sometimes immediately, sometimes days later. That's legitimate science. But a day is not a word list. A bad day is not a photograph of a threatening face. When researchers measure recall of carefully matched positive and negative word pairs, they are not measuring what happens when you lie in bed at midnight replaying an awkward conversation from 6 years ago. The proxy problem runs deep here. What's being measured is often emotionally balanced content. Stimuli deliberately stripped of context, of narrative, of personal meaning, and the findings are then generalized to something much more complex and ecologically messy. The felt quality of lived experience over time. There's a second problem layered underneath this one. The bias is not stable across people. Research from 2017 found that individuals with high anxiety show a pronounced emotional encoding bias. But importantly, the direction and magnitude of that bias shifts depending on context, mood, and what they were attending to at encoding. That's not a universal hardwired effect. That's a conditional one. A 2023 review of mood-congruent memory, the tendency to remember experiences that match your current emotional state, concluded that the relationship between emotion and memory is bidirectional, context-sensitive, and heavily modulated by factors like attention, arousal regulation, and prior expectations. In other words, who you are when something happens shapes what you remember about it at least as much as the valence of the event itself. The hardwired framing starts to look less like biology and more like a useful simplification that quietly became conventional wisdom. Let's get specific about what the evidence actually shows and where its edges are. Research published in 2025 examined something called contextual memory bias, the tendency to remember the surrounding context of emotional events differently depending on their valence. The findings pointed toward the amygdala and hippocampus working in concert during emotional encoding, with norepinephrine playing a significant role in consolidating contextually rich memories. Crucially, this research also flagged depression risk as a moderating factor. People at higher risk for depression showed a different pattern of contextual encoding than those who were not, suggesting the brain's emotional memory system is not a single universal module, but something more like a variable mechanism tuned by individual neurobiology and psychological state. Animal research adds texture here. Studies in mice examining inhibitory avoidance memory, essentially aversive learning, found that memory consolidation depended significantly on the intensity of the aversive stimulus, and differentially involved the amygdala, dorsal hippocampus, and medial prefrontal cortex depending on that intensity, even in non-human models. The picture is not negative experience encodes better, full stop. It is this depends on how intense, which circuits are active, and what the organism's current state is. Older adults are another useful case. Research on working memory and age-related emotional memory bias found that older adults often show a positivity effect. They tend to remember positive information more readily than negative. This is the opposite of what a universal hardwired negativity bias would predict. One interpretation is that older adults deploy different attentional and regulatory strategies. Another is that the developmental trajectory of emotional memory is genuinely flexible, not fixed. There's also the question of what happens when stress neuropeptides are involved more systemically. The neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary, releases oxytocin and vasopressin during psychological stress, and these have downstream effects on memory consolidation. But those effects are not uniformly negative enhancing. They modulate the system. They don't simply dial up negative memory encoding and leave everything else unchanged. And newer research on neuropeptide S, a relatively recently characterized molecule, suggests it plays a role in learning and memory that interacts with anxiety circuitry in complex ways. The field is still mapping these systems, molecular structure rendering of a neuropeptide, clean white lines on dark background. Scientific but elegant, anyone claiming clean universal rules about emotional memory encoding is running ahead of the data. What the evidence does support, fairly robustly, is that emotionally arousing experiences are often remembered more vividly than neutral ones, that threat-related information receives priority processing in several brain systems, and that this tends to be more pronounced in individuals with higher anxiety or depression risk. What it does not support, or at least not cleanly, is the claim that bad days are universally reliably remembered better than good ones, for all people, across all contexts, as a fixed feature of human neurology. What it does not spectrum bar ranging from universal law on one end to context-dependent tendency on the other. Simple graphic, muted palette. So what does this actually mean for how you interpret your own memory? One thing it might mean is that when you notice yourself replaying something bad, the meeting that went wrong, the thing you said that you wish you hadn't, you're not simply experiencing an evolutionary artifact running on autopilot. You're experiencing a system that's responding to your current state, your anxiety level, what you're paying attention to, and what narratives feel unresolved. That changes the frame somewhat. It means the asymmetry isn't necessarily permanent or fixed. It also means that when you don't remember a good day very clearly, that absence of memory doesn't mean the good day mattered less, or that your brain correctly assessed it as less important. It may simply mean you were more relaxed, less aroused, less vigilant, and those states are not optimal for encoding. There's something quietly significant in that. The days that accumulate most in memory may be disproportionately the ones where something felt at stake, not the days that were actually most valuable. If that's true, then your autobiographical memory is a somewhat biased record of your life, weighted toward moments of stress and threat, not weighted toward importance or meaning. That's a different kind of problem than the brain evolved to remember bad things. It suggests the archive you carry of your own experience needs to be read critically, not just accepted as an accurate summary. An old archive of filing drawers, some overfull and spilling, others nearly empty. Soft documentary lighting, slightly unsettling. Here's where I find myself in an uncomfortable place with this. The negativity bias framework is not wrong. There's real neurobiology behind it. Threat does mobilize memory systems. Stress hormones do affect consolidation. Those mechanisms are documented. But documented mechanism and universal law governing daily experience are not the same category of claim. And popular science often treats them as if they are. What I genuinely don't know, and I don't think the field knows cleanly either, is how much of what people report as asymmetric memory for bad days is memory bias, and how much is attentional bias, rumination, and narrative reconstruction happening after the fact. Those are different processes. They might produce the same subjective experience. But if the driver is rumination rather than encoding, then the intervention looks different and the explanation is different. That distinction still isn't settled, and it probably should be. The research behind this video draws from psychological review, brain sciences, behavior research and therapy, affective science, psychoneuroendocrinology, neurobiology of learning and memory, behavioral and brain functions, BBF, lencephaly, Every claim traces to a published source. Full citations are in the description below. If the way this channel thinks about neuroscience resonates with you, subscribing helps this work reach people who'd appreciate it. New videos on the science of mind every week.